Hey everyone, and welcome to the second VOX Out of Office stream. Today we are talking about the Cambridge 50 modeling amp. And what I really wanted to do was run through some of the versatile features of the amp, run through the amp models. And so let's do that and talk a little bit about, with those amp models, what kind of playing you can do, what genres and things like that. So, just as a heads up, so you know where you're getting audio from, the Cambridge 50 is taking the USB audio output directly into my computer, so that is all you're hearing. I have the Tone Room software up in the corner, so you can see my settings, but I'm not using anything beyond the controls on the amp. That's just for you to see. And I am playing my built Relevator LS through the Cambridge 50, just direct in. It's the same guitar as last week if you joined us then, and let's get into it. So that is just a quick example of that's a Vox AC30 normal channel tone set kind of bright with the analog delay on. That is sort of what I think of as the standard Vox sound without getting the chime quite yet. And so that's what I thought we'd start it off with. But from here, I wanted to walk through some genres and, maybe some different eras of music and try out all the different things that the Cambridge 50 can do, because this amp does have 10 different amp models as well as a line in settings, so you can plug in an acoustic guitar or a keyboard or something like that. But for today, we'll be focusing on those 10 amp models. And if we just switch up the settings on here a little bit, we can get a, very classic 60s Vox chime. So the Tone Room little picture-in-picture window does have a little bit of a lag to it that I wasn't able to sort out. So just a heads up for that. You'll see the settings adjust in a second. But what I did was take the delay off, lower the bass a bit, and raise the treble a bit. And that will give us a very 60s, chimey, rock and roll sound. So that is kind of the 60s rock and roll sound to me, to my ear. And from there, I would move to a little bit heavier of a 60s or 70s rock sound. So what I'm going to do is move over to the top boost amp model. And on the Cambridge 50, the big difference between the top boost and normal AC30 amp models is the top boost is going to give you a little bit extra gain as well as a little bit of that extra chime. And so I think the regular normal channel AC30 model for cleanish rock tones or something lower, the cleaner spectrum of an AC30. And I think the top boost amp model kind of juiced up for a little bit more heavy rock. So let's take a look at that. Looks like the picture-in-picture is not updating at all at this point. I do not know why, so I apologize for that. If it stays that way, I'll get rid of it just to avoid confusion. But right now we are on an AC30 top boost model with no delay. The treble turned a bit up and the bass as well for a bit of a heavier 60s, 70s rock sound. And if I switch my pickup to just the neck pickup, you'll hear a much more warm rhythm guitar type of setting with this. As opposed to just having my pickup selector in the middle position, so both neck and bridge pickups. Now, what I really like about the AC30 amp model on the Cambridge 50 is that it gives you a lot of that interactiveness the same way a real tube AC30 would, because of the new tube in the preamp section of the Cambridge 50. So if I jump in time a little bit to maybe more of a 90s indie rock playing style, but leave the settings the same, you'll see just from my playing that the amp adapts a bit and responds to how I'm playing and will give almost a different tone without touching the controls at all. But what I really like to do playing something like this is switch to just my bridge humbucker, which will give me a much brighter sound coming out of my guitar. And to compensate for that, I'm going to turn the bass up a bit. So I have more of a full sound from the amp, but a brighter, less low end sound coming from my guitar, and it sounds like this. So you could see, or hear rather, that when I lightened my picking, the amp really cleaned up. That is in big part thanks to the new tube that is in the Cambridge 50's preamp section. It really feels like you're playing a tube amp because there is a real tube in the preamp. And that really enhances a lot of the sounds you're getting out of these amp models. It is one of my favorite things about the Cambridge 50. So we will move on through a few more of these settings, move through a couple different eras of music and different types of amp sounds. If you are just joining us, we are talking about the Cambridge 50, and we are walking through a couple different settings, trying to show the versatility of the amp. And the big thing here is talking about the different amp models and how the new tube responds with that. We are hearing the Cambridge 50 USB audio out directly into my computer. So this is the same way that you could record yourself, or maybe just practice if you wanted to do headphone out of your computer and record while you played, although the Cambridge 50 also has a headphone output. If you have any questions about the Cambridge 50 or any suggestions of playing styles or things like that while we go through this live session, please leave them in the comments. I'm keeping an eye on those on a screen right next to my webcam, so I'm watching everything that's coming in, and I'm happy to talk about anything you want to hear. But if there is no questions, I will just run through a lot of these amp models. I have a lot planned to show you. So we've seen 60s rock and roll. We've seen a little bit of a dirtier 60s or 70s harder rock, and then just a 90s indie rock using very similar settings on the amp. Now let's jump back and move amp models to the Brit amp model. This is the Brit 1959. I wanted to make sure I got that year right. There are a few different Brit amp models. These will give you different degrees of crunch or breakup from a very mid-forward voiced amp, very British sound. I did have a little picture-in-picture of the Tone Room software, but I took that down because it stopped updating, so my apologies, you won't be able to see my settings, but we're going to dial in another variation on the 70s rock, maybe something a little bit harder, getting into the hard rock or even metal of the 70s territory. So, like I said, this is the Brit 1959 amp model. We have the gain up about noon, a little bit higher than noon. The treble is like a tiny bit below noon, like 11:30, something like that. And the bass is set somewhere between 12 and 1. And for those of you, if you haven't heard controls talked about in this way, I find it's the easiest way to talk about them. So think about it like a clock face. When the knob is pointing straight up, that's noon. And as you move to one direction or the other, clockwise, you're going towards 1, 2, etc. I think that really gets the right info across. So just for those of you who weren't familiar with that, that's how I'm talking about these knobs. So let's go into some 70s hard rock. So that was on my middle position pickup selection. If I go back, just like we did with that 90s setting, if I go back to just the bridge humbucker, it's going to have a little bit of that fullness from the amp, but a lot more punch thanks to just the bridge humbucker. So from there, I think we could dial it up a little bit. Let's bump up the gain and keep the EQ set about the same. So I just saw, I'd like to answer this before we move on. I just saw Alessandro comment. It popped up on my screen. He was asking, is the AC30 emulation the same as an MV50 AC? And the answer to that is no, because the MV50 uses a new tube in addition to analog circuitry set for just that amp, where the Cambridge 50 is using new tube in addition to digital modeling, which allows it to have those 10 amp models. And because of this, they're not entirely the same just in how you're achieving the sound, but the sound itself is the same. We worked really hard to make sure that with both of those amps, because they are using the AC30 name, that they are true to the sound of our all-tube AC30s. So again, not the same in creating the sound, but the same sound in the end, or a tiny, tiny difference. So now on to a bit heavier of a 70s hard rock or even beginnings of metal tone. So that is my middle pickup. So both pickups playing the middle position. And like I said, turning the gain up a bit on the Brit 1959. Now, if I turn the low end up on the amp a little bit, so now the bass control is about 3/4 of the way up, set to 3 o'clock. And now I move to, again, just my bridge humbucker. I'm doing this a lot because I love how this responds to the amp. and how that new tube in the preamp section really creates a huge difference just with something as simple as using both pickups or just one. So let's hear this high gain 70s rock setting. So very similar in sound, but as you could hear, a very big difference in that the quality of the low end. This is my favorite thing to do at the Cambridge 50, and if you have one or are interested in getting one, I really suggest just switching pickups, see how big of a difference that makes. So from here, I want to keep on the same amp setting, but let's go to maybe the polar opposite in terms of sound. I'm going to turn the gain almost all the way down. Let's set it about 9 o'clock, so fairly low. And while we're at it, I turned up the treble a little bit, so that's set about 1 o'clock, and I turned the bass down to about 11 o'clock. So this, I would say, is the same era, but a very, very different, more of an overdriven amp setting rather than that big tube distortion British sound that we're all familiar with. So I turned up the volume a little bit just so we can hear it better. So a lot less gain. This amp model really cleans up, as do all of the Brit amp models. They start to get into a bit of a higher gain territory once you get to the Brit VTM amp model, but especially this Brit 1959 really cleans up. And a nice thing you could do, I don't have the 5-button foot switch here with me, so I can't show you this, but I can describe it to you and try my best to adjust the knobs quickly. But something you could do very easily is set up 2 presets where you have this amp sound very clean, and then just the same preset duplicated 1 foot switch over with the gain turned up. And that would be like putting a boost in front of your amp, or switching channels, or putting a distortion or overdrive pedal in front of your amp. And so you can really think of those presets, if you have the foot switch, as on the fly adding other elements to the amp, even if you're only turning up the gain. And of course, you can save presets directly to the amp, but swapping between them is quicker with the foot switch. So like I said, I don't have the foot switch, but I'm going to try my best to show you this quickly turning up that gain knob. So there you go. It is as simple as that to jump between a clean and distorted setting on the same amp model. You don't change the character of the amp really. It really feels like swapping channels or putting a boost in front of your amp just to bring out a little bit more flavor from that amp and a little bit more breakup. So from here, let's make a big jump. I'm going to move to the next amp model, which is the the Brit 800. And I have the gain set quite a bit up at about 2 o'clock, and I'm going to turn the EQ. The treble is about 1 o'clock, and the bass is about 10 o'clock. So I've turned the bass down quite a bit, and this is going to give us a really nice, jumping ahead to the 90s, a really nice punk sound. So as you can hear, very tight, distorted, British voiced amp setting. This is my favorite of the Brit amp models. I'm really a fan of how it breaks up, and I'm going to once again show you that same trick. I'm going to switch my pickup selection from the middle position, both pickups, to just my bridge humbucker. And if I turn that bass back up, so now the treble is about 1 o'clock, the bass is about the same, and I play the same thing. You'll hear it has a lot more fullness to it without overloading in the low end, which I don't like for that fast palm muting type of playing. It starts to get things a little bit messy, but that's where I like switching to the bridge humbucker. Once again, it interacts with that new tube in the preamp of the Cambridge 50, so you're getting the bright and really tight low end of just the bridge humbucker in my guitar, but the Cambridge 50 is adding fullness through that bass control, giving this a little bit of the tight low end and a little bit of the fullness that we want to hear and don't quite get turning the volume down. So from here, if I move back to my middle position on my pickup selector and I play without touching the settings, I'm going to get a little bit more of a older punk type setting, something maybe even before punk, like proto-punk, back into the 70s or 80s. So before I get into that, if you're just joining us, we are talking the Cambridge 50 and its different modeling capabilities and the versatility of those. I am recording the Cambridge 50 through the USB output, and so you're hearing just that, which has a really nice cab simulation on there. So you're hearing about the same as what the amp sounds like in the room. And this is a really nice feature for recording yourself or setting up for something like this where you're live streaming. And I didn't have to mic anything or deal with any of that. So I'm playing my built Relevator LS. I wish I could jump between a few guitars to show you even more versatility and how that reacts with the amp, but this is all I have with me at the moment. So let's jump from a tight palm muting 90s punk back to 70s or 80s punk or proto-punk. as you hear, a lot more unruly, a lot of response coming from that low end because I have the bass control on the amp set high and I am using both pickups on my guitar. This, I think, gets you like right at the edge of total meltdown kind of sound that early punk has and that I love. It's kind of like just turning up all the knobs and seeing what happens. Although on here you have a little bit of flexibility and you can really fine tune that setting. So from there, I think if we turn and check out the lower gain setting on this same amp, we could see a little bit more of an indie rock or kind of like the Pacific Northwest indie rock on the verge of emo kind of thing. So now I have both of the EQ knobs set at noon, and I have the gain set to about 10 or 11, and you get something like this. So you'll hear a lot of responsiveness from that. I keep coming back to this because it is something that really amazes me about YouTube, and it is a reason why the Vox amps continue to use YouTube so prominently, because it gives you the character and the responsiveness of playing a much bigger, louder tube amp, but with the flexibility of all these digital models. So here we have 10 amp sounds, and as I'm showing you now, within those amp sounds, much more than one setting. Plus, when I play a setting like this, if I dig in, it starts to break up, but if I play softly, it really cleans up. So I'm going to play the first time through that progression really cleanly, playing fairly light, and then the second time I'll really dig in and you can hear that difference. So that is something that really, really amazes me about how flexible a digital amp like this can be. So if you are just joining us, we are talking Cambridge 50 and its versatility. We have walked through a few amp models at this point, the AC30 amp models, as well as 2 out of the 3 Brit amp models. And you are hearing the Cambridge 50 directly from the USB audio output into my computer, which is really convenient for streaming like this or recording yourself at home. I'm playing my built Relevator LS, and that is going just directly into the amp. So from here, I'm going to quickly show you the Brit VTM and higher in gain-wise amp models. I don't want to focus on these too much because I'm not the best high gain player, so I'm going to show you very quickly just playing 1 or 2 riffs what the difference between these amp models is. And the big one for me, even though the gain slightly changes as you move between them, the big difference you'll hear is the character of the mid-range, whether it is lowered a bit or prominent, raised a bit. If you have the Tone Room software, you can actually go in and adjust a virtual mid control with all of the modes, which is really noticeable in these modes. But I never really thought that was necessary because each mode has its own mid-range character, which means if I want to play something like early thrash or nu metal, I would go to the Brit VTM because it has a bit of a scoop to it. So here, gain, treble, and bass are all at 1 o'clock, and we're on the Brit VTM model. So you'll hear a little bit of that mid scoop, which is really nice for genres like 90s thrash and or even late 80s thrash and nu metal. So you hear a little bit of that scoop in the mid-range. If I move to the next amp model, which is the SLOD, if I play that same riff, haven't touched any settings besides the amp model, take a listen to that character of the mid-range and see how it adjusts. You have a much more prominent mid-range there, which makes those big low chords more powerful, in my opinion. But it also, it depends on the style of music you're playing and the setup of your band. So now let's move on to the final amp model, which is the double rec. And you'll hear, again, very similar gain-wise. I'm not going to touch the controls. Just take a listen to that mid-range character. Again, a more prominent mid-range. This is a very modern metal. If I were to play something like metalcore or something around that chugging, high gain type of setting, I would use either the SLOD or this double rec. If I jump back to the final Brit model, you'll hear just that change in that mid-range. Once again, it'll be really drastic coming from listening to these modes. So that's the big difference from these three amp models, the Brit VM, the SLOD, and the double rec. In my opinion, it's really that mid-range. So now let's jump back down to the cleaner the boutique, clean, and OD settings. So these are two of the cleaner amp models on the amp. So we are on the boutique OD setting, and we have a fairly low gain for this overdrive channel of a boutique amp setting. And this will give you that kind of sweet spot, modern blues or thing like that setting. I have the gains set at around 10 o'clock and the bass and treble about noon. So from here, we're going to try some blues and then some settings. So let's check that out. But first, let me tune, because playing those thrash riffs really popped my high strings out of tune. So let's hear that riff again. Now, if I really quickly adjust that one string that is popping out of tune, and I also then move to the boutique clean setting, you'll hear, I'm not going to adjust anything besides the gain. I'm going to bump that up to about noon just to have a little bit more character to it. You'll hear that you can use these kind of as a clean and dirty channel of an amp, or like we talked about before, a clean channel, as well as putting a boost or overdrive before the amp. All right, so that is kind of my take on the blues-ish rock. You'll find that type of setting in a lot of things, a lot of genres these days. So from here, I really only have one more thing I want to show you. We haven't gone into the effects on the Cambridge 50 that much. And so I want to just quick pull up a chorus and reverb setting and try to do a little bit of that 80s dream pop using the same amp setting. You'll see just adding those effects really brings out a lot from this amp model. It is not the most historically accurate for playing this type of music. Bands like that used slightly different things, but those amps that they used gave the same character, which is why using this boutique clean amp model, which will really get us very close there. So we haven't talked about any of the other effects. If you do want to see more of that, we can potentially plan a out of the office session for just the effects on the Cambridge. So if you're interested in something like that, please let us know. If not, we have a bunch of other ideas and we will be going through those in future weeks. So let's pull up a quick dream pop setting. So all I did was add the chorus effect, and I set that about halfway within its section on that multi-effects dial. This means the depth is about half as deep as it will go. And I did the same with the hall reverb, about halfway on that multi-effects dial. And I haven't touched the gain or EQ, and this is the setting that we end up with. So that could also be a kind of jazz or R&B setting with dialing that chorus to taste. It really depends on what your bandmates are playing, specifically your drummer. And that is running through all of the settings on the Cambridge 50. There's one amp model we haven't touched, which is the Deluxe Clean. I'm going to keep this same setting and move there just to hear the difference between the two, like we did with those higher gain settings. So you'll hear that amp model is a bit warmer than the Boutique Clean. It has a tiny bit of that classic American mid scoop, not quite the same as when we were looking at those high gain settings, but a little bit of mid scoop that gives you a bit of a more warmer and natural clean setting, just two different flavors of clean guitar. So that has covered all of the amp models as well as some versatile settings within those. Um, Unless you have any questions, we're going to wrap up the stream for this week. Keep an eye out on our Facebook as well as our Instagram for more out of office sessions, live streams that we will be doing hopefully every week. But like I said, keep an eye on our social media to know exactly when and what future topics will be. You can also keep an eye out for streams and Ask Me Anything sessions on our Instagram. We have scheduled for tomorrow an Ask Me Anything about gear question on our Instagram story. So tomorrow afternoon, about 4 Eastern time, you can send in your questions and I'll try to answer them the best that I can. We get some really good ones, so those are fun. Join us for that, as well as this Thursday, we have a Vox mini session with Gilby Clarke, who played with Guns N' Roses and MC5. He's a really incredible guitar player who is a very versatile guitar player, and he will be showing off some of what he does with his various AC. I believe he has a 30 and 15 hand wired. I'm not sure what he'll be using, but I know I'm looking forward to it. That is on our Instagram as well this Thursday. So keep an eye out for those. I'm not seeing any questions, so I am going to go back to the AC30 section or the AC30 model and play just a bit, and then we'll end the stream. So thank you all for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing more of you in these streams. We hope you continue to join us for them. So thank you very much. Great. Thank you all for joining us. You have a good rest of the week, and be sure to join us for those other live Ask Me Anything, as well as the live stream with Gilby Clarke on our Instagram later this week. Thank you.